Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. So, you think you're a moral person, right?
hmm
I mean, we all like to think of ourselves that way. But what if I told you that morality, that thing we believe makes us good people, could actually backfire?
It's funny, isn't it? We tend to think of morality as this black and white thing, good versus bad, right versus wrong, but it's so much more complicated than that.
That's exactly what we're diving into today with The Dangers of Morality,
By Pablo Malo.
right, by Pablo Malo. And this book really digs into some of the surprising downsides of our moral instincts.
Like, one of the main points Mello makes is that we actually need less moralizing in the world, not more, which sounds kind of counterintuitive,
It
right?
does. How can being more moral be a bad thing?
Well, he uses this analogy of tanning. Our bodies are designed to tan in the sun. It's a biological process. But we all know that too much sun can be harmful. So what do? We've created all these ways to manage it, right? Hats, sunscreen, seeking shade.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So you're saying morality is kind of like that, something we're wired for, but we need to regulate it.
Exactly. It's not about denying our moral instincts, but recognizing that they need some guardrails. And Malo actually starts the book off with this really interesting point about Darwin. Did you know that Darwin was actually terrified to publish his theory of evolution, in part because of the moral earthquake he knew it would cause?
Wow, I never thought about that. Why was he so worried?
Well, back then, everyone pretty much believed that humans were, above animals, created in God's image, the whole 9 yards. But evolution challenged that whole idea. It suggested that we're all just part of this big, messy tree of life connected to everything else.
Which, yeah, I can see how that would ruffle some feathers. People must have felt like their entire worldview was being turned upside down.
Exactly. And their place in it. In fact, there's this great quote from Darwin's biggest critic at the time, Bishop Wilberforce.
Oh, I know that name. Wasn't he a big deal?
He was a big deal. So Wilberforce said that Darwin's ideas would reduce humanity to, and I quote, degraded creatures with brute origins.
Wow. Talk about dramatic.
Yeah.
It really shows you how deeply we tie morality to our sense of self, or place in the universe.
Absolutely. And this all ties into another huge idea from the book, which is this. Our very human tendency to see the world in terms of us versus them.
Oh yeah, the good old in-group, out-group bias. We see it everywhere. Politics, religion, even just like people who prefer Coke over Pepsi.
Right. And what's so fascinating is that this us versus them thing, it's not really about being a bad person. It's more like it's hardwired into us. Back in the day, favoring your own group meant survival, protecting your resources, your people.
So we're basically wired for tribalism, even if we don't want to admit it. It's like this primal instinct that never really went away. But how does that play out with morality, specifically?
Well, think about it this way. We're naturally more altruistic, more forgiving towards people we consider part of our own moral community. But the thing is, the lines of that community can change depending on what we're talking about.
Okay, I think I see what you mean. Like, my family is obviously in my inner circle, but then there's my group of friends, my coworkers, people who share my hobbies.
Exactly. And it can even be something as simple as I'm a fan of this sports team or I believe in this political ideology.
So it's all about who we decide is worthy of our moral consideration, which, let's be honest, can get pretty arbitrary sometimes.
Exactly. The book even brings up the whole commandment, thou shalt not kill. And, historically, a lot of people have interpreted that with this unspoken caveat, like, unless they're an enemy, which really highlights how flexible our moral compass can be depending on who's on the other side.
So our moral compass is kind of like, I don't know, a little bit shaky. It's
Yeah.
not as straightforward as we like to think, that's for sure.
It's way more complex. And this is where things get even more interesting. So Malloy digs into all this research that shows how our moral beliefs, the things we hold to be morally true, actually carry more weight in our minds than other kinds of beliefs.
Carry more weight. What does that mean exactly? Like they're heavier.
Well, not literally. It means they trigger much stronger emotional responses in us. Think about it this way. You can have a calm, rational debate with someone about, like, I don't know, the best way to make a cup of coffee.
Okay, yeah. Everyone has their methods, I guess.
But if you tell someone that their way of making coffee is morally wrong, well, you're going to get a much stronger reaction.
True, true. People get really intense about their coffee. But I get what you're saying. It's like some topics just push our buttons more than others, especially if we feel like our values are being attacked.
Exactly. And because moral beliefs trigger such strong emotions, we're less likely to budge on them. We dig in our heels, become less willing to compromise. Plus, we're also more likely to want to punish people who violate those moral codes we hold, even if it means going against authority figures or breaking the rules ourselves.
Now that you mention it, I do remember reading about studies on this.
Yeah.
Like people were more likely to disobey orders from, someone in charge if they felt those orders were morally wrong.
Wild.
Wild.
It's like morality overpowers everything else. It taps into something deeper, something primal within us. Which leads us to another really big question Malo tackles, and that is this. How do things even become good or evil in the first place? Who decides?
Right. It's not like there's this universal rule book you're all given.
Right.
What's considered moral in one culture might be totally different in another.
Exactly. And this process, the way things get labeled as good or bad, Malo calls it moralization. It's like how neutral actions can suddenly take on this whole moral weight. A good example of this is diet. So vegetarianism often starts out as a personal health choice, right?
Right, like eating less meat is better for my body.
Exactly. But then it can very quickly transform into this moral position where, like, eating meat is associated with cruelty towards animals, destroying the planet, all this heavy stuff.
Yeah, it goes from a personal choice to a judgment about your character.
Exactly. And Malo's point is that this moral expansion, it's happening everywhere. All these things that used to be considered, personal preferences, like what we eat, what we wear, even the music we listen to or the shows we watch, now they're being judged through this moral lens, which can feel pretty intense.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like you can't even have an opinion these days without someone jumping down your throat about how it's morally wrong.
And social media, well, it just pours gasoline on this whole fire.
Oh, 100%. Everyone's trying to be holier than thou online, calling each other out for every little thing.
It's like this giant competition for who can be the most offended, the most morally pure. And this is where the book talks about moral grandstanding.
Moral grandstanding. What is that? Some kind of performance.
Kind of. It's the idea that people will publicly display their outrage, not necessarily because they actually care that much, but because it makes them look good to others. It's like virtue signaling on a whole other level.
Ah, okay. So it's not about actually fixing a problem or changing anything. It's about making yourself look like the good guy.
Exactly. Social media is the perfect stage for that kind of performance. It's all about those likes, shares, and comments. People are basically competing to see who can get the most validation for their moral outrage.
Kind of depressing, if you ask me. Like, are we even capable of talking about real issues anymore without it turning into this big moral drama?
It's a good question. And to understand what's really going on here, we need to look even deeper, go back to how our brains are wired in the first place. The book actually talks about this fascinating concept called supernormal stimuli.
Supernormal. Wait, stimuli.
Wow.
Okay, you have to break that one down for me.
Okay, so think about it like this. Have you ever noticed how those perfectly shaped, perfectly colored fruits in the supermarket, you know the ones, they always look way more appealing than the real deal, even though they often taste kind of bland and flavorless?
You know what? That is so true. I totally fall for those picture-perfect apples every time.
That's supernormal stimuli at work. Our brains are drawn to these exaggerated versions of things that are naturally appealing to us. And the thing is, our modern world, it's overflowing with these supernormal stimuli.
Okay, I'm starting to get the connection here. So how does this tie back to morality and social media?
Well, you could say that social media, with its carefully curated feeds, all the outrage, all the emotional stories, it's like this buffet table of supernormal moral stimuli. It's constantly bombarding us with things that are designed to trigger our moral outrage, make us feel like we need to pick a side, even if the issue itself is totally blown out of proportion.
Wow, yeah. It's like those plastic fruits, but instead of apples, it's outrage. It's all designed to grab our attention and keep us hooked.
Exactly. And because these stimuli are so strong, they really hijack our attention and our emotions. We get sucked into these cycles of outrage and moral grandstanding without even realizing what's happening. It's like we're not even thinking for ourselves anymore. We're just reacting to these exaggerated signals.
Right. It's kind of scary how, like, our brains are basically wired to fall for this stuff, Even something as simple as scrolling through our phones can mess with our heads. But before we get too deep into that, you mentioned concept creep earlier. What is that all about?
Right. So concept creep, this is another piece of the morality puzzle, and it's super interesting. It's something a researcher named Haslam observed where psychological concepts, things like trauma, for instance, they've kind of expanded over time.
I know what you mean.
So, like in the past, trauma usually referred to, a serious physical injury or witnessing something truly horrific like a war zone or natural disaster, that kind of.
Right, like really heavy stuff.
Exactly. But now, the definition of trauma has broadened to include like a wider range of experiences, even things that are like more everyday occurrences. Things like, microaggressions, feeling offended by something someone said
So
online.
we're becoming more sensitive to different types of harm, both physical and emotional.
Exactly. Which, in some ways that's a good thing, right? Being more aware of the subtle ways we can hurt each other can only be a positive step. But at the same time, Mallow argues that this constant moralization of everything, it can actually backfire on us.
Also,
Well, think about it. If literally everything has the potential to be a moral violation, then people start becoming afraid to speak their minds, afraid to take risks. It creates this culture of fear and self-censorship.
because if you say the wrong thing, even accidentally, you could be labeled as, like, a bad person.
Exactly. And it shuts down important conversations from happening because now disagreeing with someone isn't just like having a different opinion. It means you're attacking their values, you're a bad person.
Which brings us right back to that whole us versus them thing we were talking about before. It's like morality becomes the weapon we use to separate ourselves from anyone who doesn't think exactly like we do.
It's kind of a vicious cycle, isn't it? And this is where Malo really stirs the pot because he makes this pretty bold claim. He argues that the current social justice movement,
Okay.
he argues that while it obviously comes from a good place, it's actually developed some pretty strong parallels to organized religion.
Whoa. Okay, now that is a hot take. How so?
Again, he's not saying it is a religion, more that it's taken on some of the same characteristics, like it's developed its own set of strict moral codes.
Like rules you have to follow.
Right, and anyone who breaks those rules or even questions them is labeled a heretic. Just like in traditional religion, there's a big emphasis on confessing your sins.
Oh, like those public apologies people make online after they get called out for something.
Exactly, it's like a ritual. And then there's the whole, like, striving for moral purity thing, which, let's be real, is a pretty impossible standard to live up to, right? None of us are perfect.
No one's perfect. We're all just figuring it out as we go. So what's the solution then? If we buy into this idea that we might actually be better off with a little less moralizing in our lives, what are we supposed to do?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. Melo doesn't really offer one either, and I think that's kind of the point. There's no quick fix, no magic formula for how to be less moralistic. But he does talk about the importance of, like, critical thinking, self-awareness, and maybe most importantly, humility.
Humility, like admitting that we don't have all the answer.
Exactly. Being willing to say, you know what, I might be wrong about this. It's tough to do, but super important. And also remembering that even the people we most disagree with, they're coming from somewhere too. Their beliefs probably make sense to them, just like ours do to us.
That's a really good point. It's so easy to forget that when you're caught up in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, it is. But if we can just take a step back, breathe and try to understand where the other side is coming from, even if we don't agree with them, I think that's where the magic happens.
I love that. So it's less about trying to win the argument and more about just trying to understand each other better.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, right? We're all just trying to figure out this crazy thing called life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that was quite the deep dive into the world of morality.
It was. And kind of a wild ride, too.
To all our listeners out there, thanks for coming along for the journey. And as you navigate this crazy, messy world full of moral dilemmas and those super tempting plastic fruits,
Don't forget the sunscreen.
and remember, keep those minds open, keep those conversations going, and most importantly, keep questioning everything. Until next time, folks.